The moment I pressed transmit on the Deathworld frequency, every officer on my bridge went silent. Not because of the slavers cutting through our hull, not because of the screaming coming through the intercom from the lower decks. They went silent because they knew what I had just done, and every single one of them understood that what I had just invited into our lives might be worse than what was already here. My name is Varric Sohn. I am the Senior Communications Officer aboard the Galactic Medical Frigate Calm Passage, and 3 minutes before I touched that frequency, my life had been ordinary, routine even. We were running plague relief supplies to the outer colonies of the Demovan Reach, a 13-day transit through quiet space, with 2 sister ships flanking us in a loose triangle formation. The Gentle Horizon carried the bulk pharmaceuticals. The Lasting Grace carried the field hospital modules. We carried the staff, 216 medical personnel from 11 species, most of them young, most of them idealists who had signed up for aid work because they believed the galaxy was fundamentally kind. The galaxy proved them wrong at 14 minutes past the 6th hour. 6 ships dropped out of slipstream in a surrounding formation so tight that our proximity alarms screamed in overlapping cascades. Crethon vessels, heavy raiders with reinforced boarding clamps and hull-cutting arrays, already extending from their undersides like the legs of something predatory. I recognized the configuration immediately because every communications officer in the Galactic Union receives a threat identification module during training, and the Crethon slaver formation is the first image they show you. It is the most common. It is the most successful. Medical convoys are their preferred targets because medical crews are unarmed, physically fragile, and trained to preserve life rather than take it. Director Payal, our convoy commander, was standing behind me when the ships appeared. She was old for a Selvari, her feathers streaked with gray along the crest, and she had spent 40 years running aid missions into contested space. She did not panic. She placed one hand on the back of my chair and said, very calmly, that I should transmit an emergency distress signal on all standard Galactic Union frequencies and request immediate military escort. I did exactly that. The response came back in under a minute. The nearest Union patrol was 11 standard hours away. They expressed concern. They advised us to cooperate with the boarding party to minimize casualties. They told us help was coming. 11 hours. I have since learned that 11 hours is enough time for a Crethon crew to strip a medical ship to its frame, sort its occupants by species and size, and have them sedated and packaged in transport containers before the first patrol ship even begins its approach. The Union knew this. They sent the message anyway. The Cretason leader broadcast on open channel. His name was Gorath, and he spoke in the clipped, grinding syntax of his species with a translator overlay that made his words sound almost polite. He informed us that our vessels were now claimed under Cretason territorial salvage law. He said resistance would result in structural damage to our ships that would make them unsuitable for transport, which meant he would simply space anyone he could not fit in his cargo holds. He told us to power down our engines and open our airlocks. Director Payal looked at me. I looked at the scanner. On the external cameras, I could see the first boarding clamps latching onto the Gentle Horizon. The ship shuddered on the feed. A vessel designed to carry medicine being grabbed by something designed to carry people as cargo. I watched the outer airlock of the Gentle Horizon buckle inward as the Crethon cutting array began its work. The metal screamed. I could hear it through the camera's audio pickup, a sound like something alive being torn apart. Then the screaming changed. It was not metal anymore. I saw them through the feed. Young medics in pale blue uniforms being dragged from the Gentle Horizon's corridors by Crethon soldiers in heavy plating. A Tolari supply officer, barely out of training, was lifted by her arms and thrown into a line of captives, being marched toward the Crethon ship's docking collar. A Demovan pharmacist tried to run and was struck across the back with something that dropped him to the deck. They did not get up. I counted 43 crew members pulled from the Gentle Horizon in less than 2 minutes. 43 people who had signed up to deliver medicine. Director Payal was speaking into the intercom, telling our crew to remain calm, to stay in their quarters, to not resist. Her voice was steady, but her feathers were pressed flat against her skull, which in a Selvari is the equivalent of a scream. She knew what was coming. The Crethon would finish with the Gentle Horizon, and then they would come for us. I turned back to my console. My hands were shaking. I am Selvari. which means my bones are hollow and my muscles are built for precision, not strength. I weigh less than a Krethahan's arm. I cannot fight. I was not trained to fight. Nothing in my species was ever designed for violence, because we evolved on a garden world where the most dangerous predator was a slow-moving amphibian with poor eyesight. I am, by every galactic standard, physically helpless. But I can push a button. The emergency codex on my console listed every distress frequency available to a Union-registered vessel. Most of them were standard, broadcasting to patrol ships, station security, allied merchant fleets, nearby colonies. At the bottom of the list, marked in a color my species associates with extreme caution, was a frequency that every communications officer knows about and no communications officer ever uses. The annotation in the official codex read simply, Deathworld Response Channel. The unofficial annotation, the one every veteran comm officer passes down to every trainee in whispered conversations after hours, was more specific. It said, do not use unless extinction level. Consequences unpredictable. Human military response. I had been trained to avoid that frequency. I had been told stories about what happens when you invite Deathworlders into a crisis. The stories were not reassuring. They involved overwhelming force, collateral destruction, and a species that did not understand the concept of proportional response, because their homeworld had never rewarded proportionality. On Earth, I was told, the proportional response to a predator was to become a worse predator. That philosophy had followed them into the stars. I looked at the external feed. The Krethan were extending their boarding clamps toward the comm passage. In my earpiece, I could hear the muffled sounds of the Gentle Horizons crew being herded into holding cells aboard the raider ship. Someone was crying. Someone was calling for help in a language my translator could not parse, which meant they had been reduced to sounds that were not words anymore. I pressed the button. The transmission was simple. Emergency SOS. Coordinates. 3 medical ships, 6 hostile vessels. Krethan slavers. Crew being taken. No weapons. No military escort, requesting immediate assistance. I sent it on the Deathworld frequency and felt the bridge go cold around me. Director Payal's hand tightened on my chair. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she leaned close to my ear and whispered that I might have just traded one nightmare for another. I told her that at least this nightmare might fight for us instead of against us. She did not reply. The response came in 11 seconds, not voice, text only, scrolling across my console in stark white characters against the dark background of my communication array. Hold position, inbound, estimated arrival 14 minutes. 14 minutes. I read the words twice because they did not make sense. The nearest Union patrol was 11 hours away, and that was the fastest military response the most powerful governmental body in the galaxy could manage. Whatever had received my signal was 14 minutes out. That meant it was already in this sector. Already close. Already out here in the empty dark between star systems where nothing operated, nothing patrolled, and nothing lived. Except apparently something did. I reported the response to Director Payal. She read the text on my screen, and her feathers, already flat, seemed to tighten against her body, as though she was trying to make herself smaller. She asked me what kind of vessel could possibly be 14 minutes from our position in unpatrolled space. I told her I did not know. She said that was exactly what frightened her. On the external cameras, the Krethan cutting array made contact with our outer airlock. The shriek of metal being carved apart echoed through the hull. Our ship vibrated with a frequency I could feel in my hollow bones, a deep grinding resonance that made my teeth ache. The Krethan were coming through. Then they stopped. The cutting array went silent. On the camera feed, I watched the Krethan soldiers at our airlock freeze in place, their massive armored bodies suddenly rigid. One of them raised a hand to the side of his helmet, pressing something, listening to something. Then, all of them moved at once, pulling back from our hull, retracting the cutting array, retreating toward their own ship with the kind of urgency I had never seen from Krethan before. Krethan, do not rush. They are deliberate and methodical because they are always the most dangerous thing in the room, and they know it. They were rushing now. I checked my scanner and felt my stomach drop. At the edge of detection range, something was approaching. Fast, faster than anything I had ever tracked on a military-grade sensor array, It was not broadcasting an identification signal yet, but its mass profile was dense, angular, and throwing off energy readings that made my console flicker with values it was not designed to display. The Crethon comms erupted, 6 ships, all of them suddenly screaming at each other on open channels, their communication discipline shattered. I did not need a translator. The tone was universal. They were afraid. I sat at my console with the hull of my ship still ringing from the Cretheron cutting array, my hands still shaking over the controls, and I watched the scanner track something coming out of the dark toward us, at a speed that should not have been possible. I did not know what it was. I did not know who crewed it. I only knew that I had called for it, and it had answered, and it was almost here. Director Payal stood behind me, her hand on my chair, her feathers pressed against her skull, and she said something I will never forget. She said, "Whatever comes through that slipstream wake, Varric, I want you to remember that we invited it. We asked for this, and now we will see what the Deathworlders send when someone calls for help." She paused. "They do not send aid ships," she said quietly. "That is not what they do." I watched the scanner. The contact was 9 minutes out and closing fast. 7 minutes. 5. The Crethahan had stopped all boarding operations. Their 6 ships were pulling into a defensive formation, weapons arrays powering up, shields cycling to maximum. They had abandoned the captives on the gentle horizon. They had abandoned us. They were preparing to fight whatever was coming, and for the first time since the ambush began, the slavers were not the hunters. They were the prey. And they knew it. The ship that dropped out of Slipstream did not arrive the way military vessels are supposed to arrive. Union patrol ships decelerate gradually, announce their presence with identification broadcasts, and take up positions at a respectful distance before opening communications. Everything about their approach is designed to signal order, authority, and restraint. This ship did none of those things. It tore out of Slipstream so close to the Crethon formation that the gravitational wake rocked every vessel in the area. The comm passage lurched sideways hard enough to throw me against my console. My harness caught me, but I heard equipment crash to the deck behind me, and someone on the bridge let out a sharp cry of surprise. The Slipstream wake was violent, excessive, almost aggressive, as though the ship had aimed for the tightest possible emergence point on purpose, as though it wanted the Crethon to feel it arrive. My scanner struggled to resolve the contact. The readings were dense and confused, energy signatures overlapping in ways my system was not calibrated to interpret. Then the picture sharpened and I saw it. One ship, not a fleet, not a carrier group, a single vessel, and it was unlike anything in the Union ship registry. The silhouette was angular and sharp, built from lines that suggested speed and violence in equal measure. The hull was dark, almost black, and it absorbed scanner energy rather than reflecting it, which meant my instruments were reading it through its own emissions rather than my own signals bouncing back. It was studded with weapons arrays that my classification system could not fully identify. Some of them matched known human weapon types. Others returned readings that my console simply labeled as unknown. The transponder signal resolved on my screen, and I felt something cold settle into my chest. UES Carnivore, Terran Rapid Response Vessel, Classification Apex Interdiction. Director Payal was reading over my shoulder. I heard her breath catch. She said the name aloud, quietly, as though speaking it louder might draw its attention. She told me she had heard of this ship. Everyone in the Galactic aid community had heard of it. There were stories passed between relief workers at station bars, stories told with the nervous energy of people who were not sure if what they were describing was real or exaggerated. The Carnivore did not rescue people, it eliminated threats. There were accounts, unverified but persistent, that it had once pacified an entire moon in 6 hours. Not a battle, a pacification. The distinction was significant. The Crethon leader, Gorath, hailed the human vessel on open channel. I could hear the transmission on my console because the Crethon were broadcasting wide, which meant they wanted witnesses. Gorath's voice carried the hard confidence of a commander who had spent years taking what he wanted from anyone too weak to stop him. He informed the human ship that the medical convoy was seized property under Crethon territorial salvage law. He stated that the humans had no jurisdiction in this sector. He suggested, with the elaborate courtesy that Crethon use when they are establishing dominance, that the human vessel withdraw before a diplomatic incident occurred. The response came after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to feel deliberate. A human voice, female, speaking in clear galactic standard with an accent I could not place. She sounded calm, not the artificial calm of someone controlling their fear, but the natural calm of someone who did not have any fear to control. She sounded, if I had to find a word for it, almost bored. She identified herself as Captain Lena Drakov, commanding officer of the UES Carnivore, operating under Standing Terran Humanitarian Protection Mandate 774. She did not argue with Gorath's claims about territorial salvage law. She did not engage with his legal framework at all. Instead, she read back information that should have been impossible for her to possess. She said his full name. She said the designation of his flagship and its crew, complement down to the individual. She named his second in command. She named the Crethon station where his family resided. She described the layout of the station and noted that it had recently undergone structural repairs to the eastern docking arm. She said all of this in the same flat, unhurried tone, as though she were reading from a list that she found mildly tedious. Then she gave her instructions. Release all captives immediately. Power down all weapon systems. Submit to boarding and inspection. She set the deadline at 90 seconds. She did not state consequences. She did not threaten. She finished her list of demands and simply stopped talking. The open channel hissed with static, and in that static was the most eloquent threat I had ever heard. The silence was the threat. What she would do if they refused was so obvious that she did not need to say it, and by not saying it, she made it worse, because imagination is always more frightening than specifics. I stared at my scanner. The Carnivore was holding position 3,000 meters from the Cretan formation. 1 ship against 6. The math was absurd. The Cretan raiders were large, armed, and crewed by a species that averaged 3 times the body mass of a human. They had numerical superiority, and they were in a defensive formation designed to concentrate firepower on a single target. By every conventional military calculation, the human ship was outmatched. 40 seconds passed. The Cretan internal communications were frantic but contained. I could hear Gorath's officers advising caution, running threat assessments, trying to pull data on the Carnivore from their databases. Whatever they found did not calm them, but it did not produce a surrender either. At 60 seconds, Gorath laughed. It came through the open channel, as a harsh, barking sound that his translator rendered as amusement. He said the humans were bold for a single ship. He said boldness was admirable, but not a substitute for superior numbers. He ordered his ships to target the Carnivore with full weapons arrays. The channel went quiet. Then the Carnivore moved. I have watched the sensor recordings of what happened next more times than I can count, and I still cannot fully process what I saw. The human ship accelerated from a standing position to a velocity that my scanner could barely track in less than 2 seconds. The G-forces involved in that acceleration would have killed every known galactic species. Selvari would have been crushed to pulp. Even Cretan, with their dense musculature and reinforced skeletal structure, would have suffered fatal injuries at a fraction of that force. The humans endured it because humans evolved on a world with gravity heavy enough to compress their bones into something closer to stone than calcium, and their bodies were built to absorb punishment that other species could not survive. The Carnivore hit the first Krethikan ship before Gorath's weapons officers had finished locking their targeting solutions. The strike was not a broadside or a missile volley. It was a surgical application of directed energy weapons, so precisely targeted that they carved through the Krethikan vessel's engine housing without touching the hull plating around it. The ship went dark. Its drives died. It spun slowly in place, disabled but intact, its crew alive but going nowhere. The Carnivore was already past it. It crossed the gap to the second Krethan ship in a maneuver that bent at an angle my scanner registered as a sensor error because no ship that size should have been able to change direction that fast. The second strike took out weapons arrays and shield generators in a sequence so rapid that the individual shots blurred together on my tactical display. 2 ships disabled in under 20 seconds. The Carnivore did not destroy them. I want to be clear about that because it matters. The weapons on that ship could have reduced both Krethan vessels to expanding clouds of debris and superheated gas. I could see the energy readings. I could see what those weapons were capable of. Captain Dracoff chose precision over annihilation. She was not trying to kill the Crethon. She was taking them apart with the careful, deliberate efficiency of a surgeon removing something dangerous from a patient. The human ship positioned itself between the remaining 4 Crethon vessels and our medical convoy. It hung there in the void like something territorial, something that had claimed the space around us and was daring the Crethon to cross the line it had drawn. I watched its weapons arrays track across the 4 remaining ships in slow, deliberate sweeps that reminded me of the way a predator watches a group of prey animals, selecting which one to take first. I realized, with a cold clarity that made my feathers stand on end, that the Carnivore was not trying to win a battle. It was hurting the Crethon. The 2 disabled ships had been positioned on the flanks of the formation, and by taking them out first, the Carnivore had collapsed the Crethon defensive structure inward. The 4 remaining ships were bunching together, pulling into a tight cluster, because their tactical doctrine told them to concentrate firepower against a superior opponent. The humans were using that doctrine against them. They were funneling the Crethon into a kill box. Director Payal saw it too. She said, very quietly, that the humans were not responding to the Crethon formation. They were shaping it. She had spent 40 years in deep space, and she had never seen anything move the way the Carnivore moved, or fight the way it fought. She said it was like watching something from a nature documentary about apex predators, except the predator was made of metal and fire, and it was on our side. Gorath was shouting on the open channel. His confidence was gone, replaced by the ragged edge of a commander, watching his tactical advantage evaporate in real time. He ordered his remaining ships to concentrate fire on the Carnivore. All 4 ships opened up simultaneously, pouring energy weapons fire and kinetic rounds into the space where the human vessel sat. The Carnivore's hull absorbed the barrage. I watched the energy readings spike on my console as hit after hit struck the dark armor plating, and the ship did not move. It did not evade. It sat there and took everything 4 Crethon warships could throw at it, and the hull integrity readings on my scanner did not change. Not 1 point of damage registered. The armor was not just strong. It was built for a species that considered this level of punishment to be baseline, survivable, expected. Then my scanner chimed with a new contact alert, and the cold feeling in my chest became something deeper. A second signal had appeared at the edge of my detection range. Then a third. 2 more ships were inbound, and they were coming fast. The Carnivore had not been alone. It had been the first to arrive, the tip of something larger, and whatever was coming behind it was already close enough for my instruments to taste. I looked at Director Payal. She was watching the scanner with an expression I had never seen on a Selvari face before. It was not fear exactly. It was the look of someone who had just realized that the thing they had called for help was much, much bigger than they had imagined, and it was too late to take the call back. Gorath saw the new contacts too. I heard him swear in his native language, a sound that needed no translation. The 2 ships that arrived were not warships. My scanner classified them as electronic warfare vessels, smaller than the Carnivore, but bristling with antenna arrays and signal processing equipment that my instruments could not fully catalog. They took up positions flanking the Carnivore, forming a triangle around the Crethon formation, and the moment they locked into position, my entire communications board went dark. The silence was absolute. Every frequency, every channel, every signal in and out of my console simply ceased to exist for 3 seconds. My screen went black. My earpiece went dead. The ambient hum of background radiation that every communications officer learns to ignore disappeared so completely that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in the hollow chambers of my chest. Then my systems rebooted and came back online, but something had changed. The frequency spectrum was different, narrower, controlled. The human ships had created a localized signal blackout, a bubble of electromagnetic isolation around this pocket of space that prevented any transmission from reaching the outside. The Crethon could not call for reinforcements. They could not send a distress signal. They could not warn their network. As far as the rest of the galaxy was concerned, this engagement was not happening. Whatever the humans were about to do, they intended to do it without witnesses. The 4 remaining Crethon ships tried to run. I watched them on my scanner as they swung away from the formation and pushed their engines to maximum, heading for open space in 4 different directions. They were fast. Crethon raiders are built for speed, because speed is essential when your business model depends on hitting targets and disappearing before help arrives. Under normal circumstances, they would have been gone in minutes. The human electronic warfare ships did something to their drives. I do not know the technical details, and the human engineers I later asked refused to explain. But the effect was immediate and devastating. The Crediton slipstream drives, the faster-than-light systems that would have allowed them to escape, simply stopped working. All 4 ships simultaneously. The drives powered up, cycled through their activation sequence, and then shut down as though someone had reached inside each vessel and pulled the critical component out of the machine. The Crethon were stuck in normal space. They could run on sublight engines, but they could not run far enough or fast enough to matter. They were trapped. Captain Drokoff broadcast again. This time her voice carried a different quality. She was not speaking to Gorath. She was addressing the individual crew members aboard the 4 Crethon ships. She told them that their commanders were about to make a decision that would get them killed. She said this was not a prediction or a threat, but a simple observation based on the tactical situation. She told them that any crew member who wished to surrender could eject in an escape pod and would be collected safely, treated according to Galactic Union standards for prisoners, and delivered to the nearest neutral station. She gave them 60 seconds to decide. The first escape pod launched from the nearest Crethon ship at the 12-second mark. By the 30-second mark, the first ship had launched 9 pods. The second ship launched 6. Their crews were abandoning their commanders, not because of cowardice, but because the humans had given them a rational choice between surrender and death. And the Crethon rank and file were pragmatic enough to recognize when the math had changed. The officers and die-hard loyalists stayed aboard, but the crew members who had signed on for profit rather than pride took the offer. Gorath was screaming on the internal Crethon frequency. My console was picking up fragments despite the encryption because the human electronic warfare ships had cracked the Crethon communication protocols in seconds. A system that the Crethon military considered unbreakable had been opened like an unlocked door. I could hear Gorath threatening his own people, ordering them to return to their stations, raging at the betrayal. 2 of his 4 ships were hemorrhaging crew in escape pods, their combat effectiveness dropping with every departure. But 2 ships held. Gorath's flagship and 1 other vessel, crewed by loyalists who were either too committed or too afraid of their commander to abandon him. 2 ships against the Carnivore and its support vessels. The math was still terrible, but Gorath was not the kind of commander who calculated odds. He was the kind who had spent his career taking things from people who could not fight back, and that kind of mind does not pivot easily from predator to prey. He made his move. His voice came through on the open channel, and the rage was gone, replaced by something cold and calculated. He announced that he held 43 medical personnel from the Gentle Horizon aboard his flagship. Hostages. He described their species, their ages, the conditions in which they were being held. He said that if the human ships did not withdraw immediately and allow his remaining vessels to depart, he would begin executing captives at a rate of 1 per minute. He would broadcast the executions on the open channel so the humans could hear them. My blood went cold. 43 people, the medics and supply officers I had watched being dragged from the Gentle Horizon less than an hour ago. Young people, most of them, with families waiting for them on stations across the Demavon Reach. Gorath was holding them in the belly of his ship and threatening to end their lives one by one. The bridge of the Calm Passage was silent. Every officer was staring at the communications panel, waiting for the human response. Director Payal had closed her eyes. Her beak was set in a rigid line, and her hands were clenched at her sides. She was not a soldier. She was a doctor who had spent her life saving people, and now she was listening to a slaver threaten to murder her colleagues, and there was nothing she could do about it. Captain Dreykov went quiet for exactly 4 seconds. I counted them because each one felt like an hour. 4 seconds of dead air on the channel, while a human commander processed the threat that 43 innocent lives would be ended if she did not back down. Then she spoke. Her voice had not changed. The same flat, calm tone. The same unhurried cadence. She said 2 words that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Thank you for confirming their location. The channel went silent again, But this time, the silence was different. This time, it was the silence of something about to happen. I looked at my scanner and saw heat signatures detaching from the Carnivore. Small signatures. Individual. 7 of them, moving fast across the void between the Carnivore and Gorath's flagship. They were not shuttles. They were not drones. They were people. Individual human soldiers in powered combat armor, crossing open vacuum with nothing but thruster packs and whatever was built into their suits. No ship, no vehicle. Just 7 humans launching themselves across the empty dark toward a hostile warship full of armed Cretian soldiers. And they were moving so fast that my scanner had trouble maintaining locks on them. I watched them hit Gorath's flagship in 3 simultaneous breach points: portside, starboard, and ventral. The hull charges they carried blew inward, creating entry points through reinforced military-grade armor plating, and the 7 soldiers went through the gaps without slowing down. They moved from vacuum to atmosphere to combat in a single continuous motion that lasted less than 2 seconds. I could hear the aftermath on the Creton internal communications that the human electronic warfare ships had cracked open. Gunfire, shouting, the heavy thud of Creton bodies hitting deck plating. The sounds were sharp and brief, controlled bursts of violence with no wasted motion and no hesitation. The Creton soldiers aboard the flagship outweighed the humans by a factor of 3, outnumbered them by more than 10 to 1, and were fighting on their own ship in spaces they knew intimately. It did not matter. The human boarding team moved through the flagship like something inevitable. The internal comms picked up Creton officers trying to coordinate a defense, and failing, because the humans were too fast, too precise, and too willing to close the distance to a range where the Creton size advantage became a liability. In close quarters, the humans used their smaller frames to move through spaces the Creton could not, hitting from angles that the ship's interior was not designed to defend. They did not fight the way the Creton expected soldiers to fight. They fought the way predators hunt, with ambush, speed, and an absolute refusal to engage on anything but their own terms. 4 minutes. The boarding action lasted 4 minutes from first breach to final report. The human team leader's voice came through on the tactical channel that my console was now receiving, courtesy of the electronic warfare ships. Calm, professional, and brief. All hostages secured. 43 medical personnel accounted for. 0 friendly casualties. 0 hostage casualties. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. 43 people were safe. The medics and officers who had been dragged screaming from the gentle horizon were alive, because 7 humans had thrown themselves across open space and dismantled a Cretan warship from the inside in less time than it took me to calibrate my communication array. Director Payal opened her eyes. She asked me, in a voice that was very controlled, how many Cretan the boarding team had neutralized during the operation. I checked the data that was streaming across my console from the human tactical feed. I told her the number. She said nothing. Her feathers pressed so flat against her body that she looked like a different person, smaller and older, and she turned away from the console without speaking. I did not ask what the number meant to her. I already knew. It meant that 7 humans had walked into a ship full of armed soldiers and done what needed to be done to save 43 lives, and they had done it with a speed and efficiency that made it look practiced. Routine, as though this was just another operation, and the lives hanging in the balance were motivation enough to execute flawlessly. The last Cretan ship surrendered 6 seconds after the boarding team reported success. Its captain broadcast a full surrender on the open channel, his voice stripped of everything except the raw acknowledgement that the situation was over. The Carnivore's support ships moved in to secure both vessels, locking their systems and deploying containment protocols that prevented any last-minute attempts to flee or scuttle. The entire engagement, from the moment the Carnivore dropped out of slipstream to the final surrender, had lasted 11 minutes. The freed hostages were transferred from Gorath's flagship to the Calm Passage in groups of 5, escorted by human soldiers who moved with careful, measured steps alongside them. The first group came through our airlock, and I barely recognized them. These were the same medics I had watched being dragged from the gentle horizon. But the terror of the last hour had reshaped them. Their uniforms were torn. Some had bruises from rough handling. A Tolori nurse was holding her arm at an angle that told me something was broken. They came through the airlock and saw Selvari faces and familiar uniforms, and several of them simply collapsed. Not from injury. From the sudden release of tension that comes when the body finally understands that survival is no longer in question. Our medical teams caught them, held them, guided them to examination stations where the injuries could be catalogued and treated. I stood by the airlock and counted every person who came through. 43. Every single one. Alive and accounted for. I had watched them being taken, and now I was watching them come back. And the distance between those two moments was 11 minutes, and the intervention of a species the rest of the galaxy was afraid of. I sat at my console and tried to process what I had just witnessed. 11 minutes. The Galactic Union Patrol was still 10 hours away. The Union had told us to cooperate with the slavers and wait for help. The humans had covered the same distance in 14 minutes and ended the crisis in 11 more. 25 minutes total against 11 hours. The math was not just different. It was a different kind of math entirely, as though the humans operated on principles that the rest of the galaxy had not yet discovered. On the external cameras, I watched human soldiers in heavy combat armor escorting Crethon prisoners from the disabled ships. The size difference was jarring. The Crethon are large, broad, built like something that expects to dominate every physical confrontation through sheer mass. The human soldiers handled them with a casual efficiency that made the Cretan look almost fragile, directing them into lines, securing their arms, moving them toward containment areas, with the kind of practiced ease that suggested this was not the first time they had done this, and it would not be the last. Captain Dreykov contacted the comm passage on a direct channel. Her voice was different now. The cold operational tone was gone, replaced by something warmer, more human, in the way that word carries meaning beyond species classification. She requested permission to send a medical assessment team aboard our vessel to check our crew for injuries. She used the word please. The same commander who had dismantled 6 warships in 11 minutes said please when asking to send medics to help us. I granted permission because I did not know what else to do. The humans who boarded the comm passage came through our airlock in groups of 3. They were enormous by galactic standards, tall and broad and dense with muscle that moved under their skin like something coiled. Their faces were scarred, marked by old injuries that had healed into raised lines of tissue that their bodies had repaired with a brute force efficiency no other species could match. They moved through our corridors with a careful awareness of their own size, ducking through doorways designed for Selvari proportions, stepping around equipment with the measured caution of someone who knew they could break things without meaning to. They were gentle. That is the detail I come back to every time I remember that day. These were the same soldiers who had breached a warship and fought their way through armed Crethon in close quarters. The same hands that had done that work now moved through our medical bay with a softness that seemed almost impossible. They checked our crew for injuries. They brought portable scanning equipment and medical supplies from the Carnivore. They spoke quietly, using simple words and calm tones, adjusting their voices and their posture to avoid startling the smaller, more fragile species around them. One of the human medics, a large man with dark skin and a scar running from his temple to his jaw, knelt beside a young Selvari child who had been aboard as a patient in our care ward. The child was frightened and crying, overwhelmed by the noise and the shaking and the hours of terror that had preceded this moment. The human medic knelt down to the child's level, moving slowly so as not to startle her. He held out one hand, palm up, fingers open, and waited. The child looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She reached out and wrapped her small fingers around one of his, and she held on. I watched from across the medical bay, and something in my chest broke open and reformed into a shape I did not recognize. Those hands, those same hands, the ones that had fought, and the ones that were now holding a child's fingers with impossible care. They were the same hands, the same species, the same ship. Director Payal was standing beside me, watching the same scene. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said very softly that she was beginning to understand why the galaxy was afraid of humans. Not because of what they could destroy, she said, because of how quickly they could switch from one thing to the other. Destruction and compassion, contained in the same body, deployed with the same precision. That kind of versatility, she said, that kind of range, was more frightening than simple violence. because it meant you could never predict what they would do next. I told her I thought it was the most extraordinary thing I had ever seen. She said she was not sure extraordinary was a strong enough word. I spent the next 2 days as the designated liaison between the calm passage and the Carnivore, while our convoy underwent emergency repairs. The human engineering teams worked on our ships with the same unsettling competence their soldiers had shown in combat, diagnosing structural damage, fabricating replacement parts from materials I did not recognize, and sealing hull breaches with a bonding compound that they applied by hand and that hardened into something stronger than the original plating. I shadowed a human combat medic named Sergeant Kofi Asante during the medical operations across all 3 ships. Kofi was the man I had watched kneel beside the Selvari child, the one with the scar from temple to jaw, and up close, he was even more imposing than he had appeared from across the medical bay. He stood nearly twice my height, and his arms were thicker than my torso. When he walked through the corridors of the calm passage, the deck plating vibrated under his weight in a way that it never did under Selvari feet. But he was careful. He was always careful. He moved through spaces designed for lighter species, with a constant awareness of his own mass and strength, adjusting his stride, moderating his voice, keeping his gestures small and controlled. I asked him once if it was difficult, being so conscious of his body all the time. He laughed and said he had grown up with a younger brother and 2 cats, and if you could learn to move carefully around a sleeping cat, you could learn to move carefully around anything. I learned things about humans during those 2 days that no briefing document had ever conveyed. The facts in the Galactic Union Species Registry described humans in clinical terms: high-gravity origin species, persistence predator lineage, elevated pain tolerance, rapid tissue regeneration, omnivorous dietary range. Those words are accurate, but they communicate nothing about what it actually means to exist in the same space as a human being. Their bones are reinforced with a mineral density that makes them functionally unbreakable, under conditions that would shatter Selvari anatomy. When Kofi cut his hand on a piece of damaged hull plating, I watched the wound stop bleeding in under a minute. Not because he applied medical treatment, but because his blood contained clotting factors so aggressive that his body sealed the injury almost before he noticed it. He looked at the cut, flexed his hand, and went back to work. A Selvari would have required medical intervention for an equivalent wound. A human treated it as an inconvenience. Their immune systems were classified as hazardous in the Union Medical Database. Human blood contained white cell populations so aggressive that they attacked foreign biological material on contact, which meant that a simple blood transfer from a human to most other species would trigger a catastrophic immune response in the recipient. The humans carried warning labels on their medical kits, not for their own protection, but for the protection of the other species they might need to treat. Kofi told me about Earth with the casual familiarity of someone describing a childhood home, unaware that every detail he shared was terrifying by galactic standards. He described a world of extreme geological instability, where the ground itself could tear open and swallow cities. He mentioned oceans filled with predators that could detect a single drop of blood from kilometers away. He talked about weather systems that generated rotating columns of air, powerful enough to lift structures off their foundations and carry them for miles. He described seasons of extreme cold where water fell from the sky as frozen crystals and buried entire regions under meters of white powder, and seasons of extreme heat where the air itself became dangerous to breathe. He described all of this as normal, not hostile, not extreme, just the place where he grew up, the place that made him what he was. I asked him about human endurance, because the boarding action I had witnessed seemed to defy the limits of what a biological organism should be capable of sustaining. He explained that humans were persistence predators by evolutionary design. On Earth, their ancestors had hunted prey not by being faster or stronger, but by being relentless. They would chase an animal for hours, sometimes entire days, walking and jogging across open terrain, until the prey simply collapsed from exhaustion. The animal would sprint ahead, stop, recover, and then watch in mounting horror as the human appeared on the horizon again, always coming, never stopping, never giving up. The prey was faster in every burst, but the human was there for every one of them, and eventually, that was enough. That instinct had carried forward into everything humans did. Their soldiers did not tire the way other species tired. They could sustain combat operations for periods that Union military doctrine classified as biologically impossible. They slept less, recovered faster, and maintained cognitive function under levels of physical stress that would leave a Selvari unconscious. Kofi told me that during training, human recruits were deliberately kept awake for days and then asked to perform complex tasks, and most of them could do it. Not well, he admitted, but they could function when their bodies were screaming at them to stop, and in combat, the ability to function badly was often the difference between victory and death. I asked him why humans volunteered for deep space rapid response duty. The deployment was long, the conditions were isolated, and the work, as I had just witnessed, was violent and dangerous. Kofi was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that I have thought about every day since. He said that when humans first reached the stars, they discovered that the galaxy was full of species that had evolved on worlds far gentler than Earth. Worlds without apex predators, without extreme weather, without the constant pressure of survival that had shaped human physiology and psychology. And humans realized that these species, brilliant and kind, and capable of wonders that humans could barely comprehend, were vulnerable in ways that humans were not. The dark spaces between stars held dangers, and most species were not built to face them. So humans decided to be the ones who patrolled those spaces, not because they were asked, not because any treaty required it, because they had spent thousands of years on Earth being the most dangerous thing on their own planet, and they had learned the hard way what happened when that power was used without purpose. They had nearly destroyed themselves with it. Wars, famines, ecological collapse. They had stood on the edge of extinction and looked into the abyss of their own capacity for destruction, and they had pulled back. When they reached the stars, Kofi said, they found a use for what they were. They found species that needed protection. They found dark corners that needed someone willing to walk into them, and they decided, as a species, that the thing that had almost killed them, their strength, their endurance, their predatory instincts, would be the thing they used to keep everyone else safe. The Carnivore was not nearby by accident, he told me. Human rapid response ships were positioned throughout the galaxy, in every sector, in the spaces between systems where no one else patrolled. They were always close, they were always listening, and when someone called for help on that frequency, they came. Every time, no exceptions, no political calculations, no jurisdictional debates. Just a ship, already close, already ready, because someone had decided it should be there. I asked Kofi if the other species in the galaxy knew about this. He shrugged and said some did. Most did not. Humans did not advertise their patrol networks because the politics of it were complicated. Some species feared human military presence. Some governments saw it as overreach. So the humans kept quiet and kept patrolling, and when someone lit the distress beacon, they answered it, and then they moved on, before anyone had time to file a formal complaint. That evening, Captain Dracov called a meeting aboard the Carnivore and invited Director Payal and me. Walking through the interior of that ship was an experience I was not prepared for. The corridors were wider than Selvari design standards, built for a species that needed room to move in combat armor. The walls were reinforced and scarred, marked by old damage that had been repaired but not polished smooth. Unit insignia and personal markings covered surfaces in patterns that I later learned represented the histories of the crews who had served aboard. Names, dates, symbols, a running record of the people who had lived and worked and fought within these walls. It was not beautiful. It was not elegant, but it felt real, in a way that Union vessels, with their polished surfaces and regulated aesthetics, never did. Dracov met us in a briefing room that was dominated by a holographic display table. She was smaller than I expected, shorter than Kofi by a full head, with sharp features and pale eyes that moved with the constant alertness of someone who processed information the way a predator processed movement. She shook my hand with a grip that was carefully moderated, firm enough to communicate respect without enough force to injure my hollow bones. I appreciated the calibration. She activated the display and showed us a map of the sector. 14 points of light appeared, scattered across the region in a pattern that suggested deliberate placement. Slave stations, she said. Crethan operations. Part of a network that had been running for over a decade, processing captives from raided convoys and selling them to buyers across 3 adjacent sectors. 6,000 captives, she said. The number hung in the air of the briefing room like smoke. 6,000 people from dozens of species, held in conditions that the Galactic Union had been aware of for years and had classified as an internal Krethon cultural practice to avoid the political complications of a confrontation. Dreykov did not ask permission. She did not request authorization. She informed us that the Carnivore and its support vessels would be dismantling the network. All 14 stations. She presented it as a statement of fact, the way someone might announce that it was going to rain. The tone implied that the decision had been made the moment the first intelligence on the network had been confirmed, and that our ambush had simply moved the timeline forward. She offered the medical convoy the opportunity to follow behind the assault operations and provide immediate aid to freed captives. Medical triage, trauma support, evacuation to safe colonies. She said she understood if we declined because it was not what medical ships were designed to do. Director Payal hesitated. She looked at me, and I could see the conflict in her posture, the way her feathers shifted between flat caution and raised determination. She had spent 40 years running aid missions. She had never followed a warship into combat. I spoke before she could answer. I told Dreykov that we had sent the SOS. The humans had answered. 43 of our people were alive because of what the Carnivore had done. If there were 6,000 more people waiting in cages for someone to open the doors, then the least we could do was be there when those doors opened. Director Payal looked at me for a long moment. Then she straightened her posture, lifted her crest, and told Captain Dreykov that the medical convoy would follow. The first station fell in 22 minutes. The convoy held position at a safe distance while the Carnivore made its approach. The station was larger than I expected, a sprawling structure built into an asteroid with external gun platforms, shield generators, and fighter bays cut into the rock. It was a fortress, designed to repel exactly the kind of assault the humans were about to attempt. The Carnivore did not slow down. It drove straight through the defensive perimeter at full speed, absorbing fire from the gun platforms without changing course. The station's weapons hit the dark hull, and the energy dissipated across the armor plating, like water striking stone. Human engineering was not elegant. It was not sophisticated in the way that Selvari technology was sophisticated, with its emphasis on efficiency and minimal resource expenditure. Human engineering was built on a philosophy of overwhelming resilience. They did not dodge. They did not evade. They built things that could take the hit and keep moving. The station's defenses fell in sequence as the Carnivore methodically eliminated each gun platform and shield generator. The human support ships moved in behind, jamming communications and preventing any distress signals from reaching the wider Krethon network. The boarding teams launched from the Carnivore in the same terrifying fashion I had witnessed before, individual soldiers crossing open vacuum in powered armor, breaching the station's hull at multiple points, and moving through the interior with the coordinated precision of something that had been rehearsed 1,000 times. 22 minutes. From approach to all clear. We moved in after the fighting stopped. The medical teams from the Calm Passage, the Gentle Horizon, and the Lasting Grace entered the station through the breaches the humans had created, and what we found inside changed me in ways I am still trying to understand. 800 captives. 800 people from species I recognized: Selvari, Demivan, Tolori, Gathron, and others, kept in holding cells that were barely large enough to stand in. The conditions were beyond anything I had imagined. The cells were dark, unventilated, and stacked in rows that extended deep into the asteroid's interior. The captives had been fed enough to keep them alive and nothing more. Many were injured. Some had been there for months, some for years. I helped evacuate a section of cells near the station's lower levels. A Demivan elder, thin and trembling, grabbed my arm as I guided her toward the exit corridor. She was so weak that her grip barely registered on my skin, but her eyes were sharp and clear and full of something that I can only describe as desperate, disbelieving hope. She asked me who had sent the warship. I told her humans had come. She began to weep. The tears ran down her face in the thin streams that Demivan physiology produces, and she said something that broke me open. She said they had prayed to every god they knew. She said they had screamed into the dark and begged the universe for someone to hear them. She said they had given up, All of them. They had accepted that no one was coming. And then the walls had shaken, and the doors had opened, and soldiers in dark armor had stepped through, and said the words that she had stopped believing she would ever hear. "You are safe now. We are taking you home." I held her hand and walked her to the medical shuttle, and I understood something that I had not understood before. The SOS I had sent from the bridge of the calm passage had not just saved my convoy. It had triggered something larger. The humans had been watching the Crethon network for months, building intelligence, mapping stations, waiting for the right moment. Our distress call had been the spark, but the fire had been laid long before we arrived. There were 13 more stations, 6,000 more people waiting in the dark, and the Carnivore was already plotting its course to the next target. I looked at the Demavon elder as the medics took her aboard the shuttle. She was still weeping, but she was smiling too, and the combination made my chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with physical pain. I went back inside the station. There were more cells to open. Over the following 6 days, the Carnivore and its support vessels moved through the Crethon slaving network like a blade through silk. Station after station fell in the same pattern. The human warship would approach, absorb whatever defensive fire the station could produce, and systematically dismantle the weapons and shields while the boarding teams breached the hull and fought their way to the holding cells. The medical convoy followed in the wake of each assault, moving into the cleared stations to provide aid, treatment, and evacuation. I stopped counting the individual operations after the 5th station, not because they blurred together, but because each one was distinct in ways that made counting feel inadequate. Each station held different species in different conditions. Some captives had been held for weeks. Others had been there so long that they had forgotten what natural light looked like. The injuries varied. The trauma varied. The expressions on their faces when the doors opened and they saw people who were not their captors, that was always the same. Disbelief first, then the slow, agonizing transition to hope, then the collapse, the moment when the body finally allowed itself to feel what the mind had been holding back, and they fell apart in the arms of whoever was closest. Our medical teams worked without rest. The Selvari medics who had signed up for plague relief found themselves treating malnutrition, untreated fractures, infections that had been left to fester for months, and the deep psychological wounds that captivity leaves on a conscious mind. They were not trained for this. They were trained to administer vaccines and distribute medication, not to hold the hand of someone who had been locked in a dark room for 2 years and could not stop screaming when the lights came on. They did it anyway, every single one of them. I remember the 4th station in particular. It was smaller than the others, a converted mining platform hidden in the debris field of a shattered moon. The captives there numbered only 60, but they were all children. Juveniles from 7 different species, taken from colonies and transport ships over a period of 3 years, held in conditions that I cannot describe without my hands beginning to shake. The Crethon had been selling them to labor operations in adjacent sectors, and the youngest among them was barely old enough to speak. The human boarding team that cleared that station reported all clear in their usual clipped, professional manner, but when our medical teams went in and found the children, something changed on the tactical channel. One of the human soldiers, a woman whose voice I had heard calling out coordinates and breach points with perfect composure moments earlier, went quiet for a very long time. When she spoke again, her voice was different, tighter, as though she was holding something back by force. Kofi told me later that the humans had a word for what they felt in moments like that. He said the closest translation in Galactic Standard was a cold anger, the kind that does not burn itself out, but instead settles into the bones and stays there, quiet and patient, fueling everything that comes after. He said every human on the Carnivore carried that cold anger after the 4th station, and it made them faster, more precise, more certain that every remaining station needed to fall. I watched our people transform during those 6 days. The young medics who had been pulled screaming from the gentle horizon during the initial ambush worked alongside the human soldiers who had rescued them, and the dynamic between the two groups shifted in ways that fascinated me. The fear that the Selvari and other species had felt toward the humans did not disappear. It evolved. It became something more complicated, a mixture of awe, gratitude, and a lingering unease that came from standing next to something so fundamentally more powerful than yourself, and trusting that it would not turn that power against you. The humans earned that trust, station by station. I watched Captain Drakov during the 7th assault. Her ship had taken a direct hit from a heavy weapons platform that had been concealed inside the asteroid housing, a trap designed to catch attackers off guard. The Carnivore's hull held, but the impact threw the ship sideways, and I saw damage indicators flash across the tactical feed for the first time in the campaign. Drakov adjusted course, eliminated the hidden platform, and completed the assault without pausing to assess the damage. Afterward, when the boarding teams reported all clear, she walked through the cleared station personally. She did this at every station. Not as a commander inspecting a battlefield, but as a human being, witnessing what had been done to the people inside. At the 7th station, I watched her carry an unconscious child through a corridor that was filling with smoke from a ruptured power coupling. The child was Gathran, small and limp, with burns along one side of their body from the power failure that had swept through the station during the assault. Drakov carried them cradled against her chest, her combat armor scorched and dented, running through fire because the medical shuttle was on the far side of the station and the child could not wait. She handed the child to a Selvari medic at the shuttle entrance, turned around, and went back into the burning corridor for more. She did not say anything. She did not wait for thanks. She just went back in. I have replayed that moment in my mind hundreds of times since. The image of a human commander, the captain of the most lethal ship I have ever encountered, running through fire to save a child who was not her species, not her responsibility, not her mission. She did it because the child was there, and she was there, and she could. And for humans, that equation has only one answer. The 9th station was the largest. Over 1,500 captives held in a facility that had been built into a dead moon, buried under kilometers of rock, with a single access point that was heavily fortified. The Carnivore could not breach it the way it had breached the others. The rock was too thick, the facility too deep. Drakov did not hesitate. She sent the boarding teams in through the single access point, a frontal assault against prepared defenses, because there was no other way in, and 1,500 people were on the other side. I listened to the tactical feed as the human soldiers fought their way down a 2-kilometer tunnel against entrenched Krethon positions. The fighting lasted 40 minutes, the longest engagement of the campaign. I heard voices on the human channel calling out positions, coordinating movements, reporting injuries. Human injuries. They were not invulnerable. They bled. They broke bones. They felt pain. They kept going. 40 minutes. 1,500 captives freed. 11 human soldiers injured, 3 of them seriously, 0 captive casualties. I visited the human medical bay aboard the Carnivore after that operation. The 3 seriously injured soldiers were being treated by their own medics, and I saw for the first time what human damage looked like up close. One soldier had taken a projectile through the shoulder that had shattered bone and torn through muscle, and he was sitting upright on the treatment table, talking to the medic working on him, as though the hole in his body was a minor scheduling conflict. The medic was pulling fragments from the wound, and the soldier barely flinched. His body was already trying to heal around the damage, blood clotting, tissue swelling to protect the injury, his immune system mobilizing with the aggressive efficiency that made human biology so remarkable and so terrifying. He saw me watching and grinned. He told me it looked worse than it felt. I knew he was lying. I also knew that for a human, lying about pain was not deception. It was culture. They minimized their injuries because their evolutionary history had taught them that admitting weakness attracted predators, and that instinct ran so deep that even in a medical bay surrounded by allies, they could not entirely turn it off. On the 11th day of the campaign, with 12 of the 14 stations cleared and over 5,000 captives evacuated, the Galactic Union finally responded. A diplomatic envoy arrived in a polished cruiser that looked out of place among the battered hulls of the human warships and the scarred medical frigates of our convoy. The diplomat was a Cathari, tall and thin, and wrapped in the formal robes of the Union's External Relations Bureau. He requested a meeting with Captain Drakov aboard the Carnivore. I attended as the medical convoy's liaison. Director Payal came as well. The diplomat stood in the same briefing room where Drakov had shown us the map of the slaving network, and he delivered a prepared statement about the Union's concern regarding unauthorized military action in a contested sector. He used words like jurisdiction, protocol, and proportional response. He expressed the Union's position that human military operations outside of formal alliance frameworks created dangerous precedents and risked destabilizing relationships with the Cretan government. He suggested that the matter should have been referred to the Union Security Council for deliberation, and that a diplomatic solution might have been possible if the humans had followed proper channels. Dreykov listened to the entire statement without interrupting. She stood with her arms folded, and her pale eyes fixed on the diplomat with an expression that I had come to recognize as her particular form of patience, the kind that was measured in seconds rather than minutes. When the diplomat finished, Dreykov activated the holographic display. It showed a single image, 5,612 faces, every captive that had been freed from the 12 stations, every species, every age. They filled the display in a grid that stretched from floor to ceiling, row upon row of faces that had been locked in darkness until the Carnivore had come. She asked the diplomat one question. How long had the Union known about these stations? The diplomat shifted his weight. He adjusted his robes. He said that intelligence regarding the Krethamen network had been assessed by the appropriate committees, and that the situation had been classified according to standard Union protocols for internal species affairs. Dreykov repeated the question, how long? The diplomat's composure cracked. He admitted that preliminary intelligence on the network had been available for several years. The Union had classified the Krethahan operations as an internal cultural practice, which under Union Charter placed them outside the jurisdiction of external intervention. The decision had been made at the council level to avoid a confrontation with the Krethahan government that might destabilize the sector. Several years. The words hung in the briefing room like something toxic. Several years of knowing that thousands of people were being held in cages, sold as property, and treated as cargo, and the most powerful governmental body in the galaxy had decided that the politics of confrontation were too complicated, so they had looked away. Dreykov nodded slowly. She told the diplomat that humans did not classify slavery as a cultural practice. Humans classified it as a reason to send the Carnivore. She said this without raising her voice, without anger, without any of the emotional weight that the statement carried. She said it as a fact, the way she might state her ship's engine specifications or the composition of her crew. She told the diplomat that the remaining 2 stations would be cleared within 48 hours and that the 6,000 freed captives would be relocated to safe colonies with full medical support. She said the Union was welcome to file whatever diplomatic protests it wished, and she would read them when the last cage was empty. The diplomat left. No sanctions were filed. No resolutions were passed. No government in the galaxy wanted to be the one that officially punished a species for freeing slaves, because even in the most cynical corridors of galactic politics, there are some things that cannot be defended publicly. The last 2 stations fell on schedule. 6,341 captives freed across 14 stations. The number is exact, because I counted them, every single one. On the final day, with the campaign complete and the freed captives being transferred to colony ships for relocation, the Carnivore prepared to depart. The ship had taken damage during the campaign, hull scarring from the 7th station's hidden weapons platform, stress fractures from the high-G maneuvers that the crew endured as a matter of course, and cosmetic damage from a dozen engagements that would have destroyed any other vessel in the galaxy. The humans repaired what was critical and accepted the rest. Scars, Kofi told me, were just proof that you showed up. I said goodbye to Kofi at the airlock between our ships. He shook my hand the way humans do, wrapping his fingers around mine with a pressure so carefully measured that I could feel the restraint behind it. The strength he was not using, the force he was choosing not to apply. I told him that I would remember what he had taught me about his species. He smiled, and it was a warm, open expression that transformed his scarred face into something that no species in the galaxy would describe as threatening. He told me to take care of my people. He said the galaxy needed more species willing to run towards suffering instead of away from it, and that the Selvari Medical Corps was braver than most military organizations he had worked with. I told him that was generous. He told me it was accurate, and that bravery was not about being able to fight. It was about showing up when showing up was dangerous. and our medics had done that at every station without hesitation. Then he walked through the airlock and back to his ship, and I did not see him again. I met with Captain Dreykov one final time in the briefing room. The holographic display was dark. The room was quiet. She looked tired, in a way that I had not seen before. Not the physical exhaustion of a body pushed too hard, but the deeper weariness of someone who has seen too much suffering and absorbed it without letting it slow her down. I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest since the first moment on the bridge of the calm passage. Why were the humans so close? Why was the Carnivore positioned in an empty sector of space, where nothing happened, close enough to respond to my SOS in 14 minutes? Who had decided to put a warship there, in the dark, waiting for a call that might never come? Dreykov leaned against the display table and looked at me with those pale, alert eyes. She told me the truth, and I will carry it with me forever. Humans maintain rapid response ships in every sector of the galaxy. Not some sectors, every sector. Warships, support vessels, medical frigates, electronic warfare platforms. An entire network of ships positioned in the spaces between stars, in the dark lanes where no one else patrols, where no one else goes, because there is nothing there worth protecting. Except, Dreykov said, that there is always something worth protecting. The ships that transit those lanes. The convoys that cross those gaps. The people who travel through the dark trusting that the dark is empty. Humans put their ships there because the dark is not always empty, and someone needs to be close enough to respond when it turns hostile. No treaty requires it. No alliance mandates it. No government pays for it. The Terran military funds the patrol network from its own budget, absorbs the cost as a standing operational expense, and never asks for reimbursement or recognition. They do it because 3,000 years ago, humans were the most dangerous thing on their own planet, and they almost destroyed everything, including themselves. They burned their forests. They poisoned their oceans. They turned their weapons on each other and came within a breath of ending their own story before it had a chance to mean anything. They pulled back from that edge. They looked at what they had almost done, and they decided that the capacity for destruction that evolution had given them would have a purpose. Not conquest, not domination, protection. When they reached the stars and found a galaxy full of species that had never needed to evolve the ability to fight, they saw something they recognized. Vulnerability. The same vulnerability that Earth's gentler creatures had faced before humans learned to be stewards instead of predators. And they made the same choice they had made on Earth, the choice that defined them as a species. They would be the ones who stood between the vulnerable and the dark, always, everywhere, without being asked. Dreykov smiled, and it was a tired smile, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time. She said the galaxy calls them Deathworlders, like it is an insult. Like being forged on a world that tried to kill them every day of their evolutionary history is something to be ashamed of. She said humans do not hear it as an insult. They hear it as a job description. Deathworlders. The ones who survived death. The ones who can walk into the dark places where other species cannot go. The ones who show up when the signal comes and do what needs to be done, and then disappear back into the void before anyone has time to say thank you. She shook my hand one last time and walked me to the airlock. The Carnivore's engines were already warming, a deep vibration that I could feel through the deck plating and up through my hollow bones. The ship was leaving, moving on to the next sector, the next patch of empty dark where it would wait, silent and ready, for the next call. I returned to the calm passage and sat down at my communications console. The convoy was repaired, resupplied, and ready to resume its original mission. The plague relief supplies still needed to reach the outer colonies. Life continued. I opened my emergency codex and scrolled to the bottom of the frequency list. The Deathworld response channel was still there, still marked in the color my species associates with extreme caution. The annotation still read, "Do not use unless extinction level. Consequences unpredictable. Human military response." I deleted the annotation, all of it. The warnings, the cautions, the carefully worded advisories about unpredictable consequences and disproportionate force. I deleted every word that generations of communications officers had written to keep people away from that frequency, every carefully constructed barrier of fear and uncertainty that stood between a desperate signal and the only species in the galaxy that would answer it without hesitation. In the empty space where the warnings had been, I wrote a single word: hope. I saved the file and closed the codex. They call them Deathworlders, and they mean it as a warning. They say it in hushed voices, at diplomatic receptions, in classified briefings at military academies, in the quiet conversations that happen when the lights are low and the topic turns to things that frightened people prefer not to discuss openly. Deathworlders, a species forged in fire and gravity and violence. A species that should not exist by the gentle standards of a galaxy that evolved on kinder worlds. But I pressed that frequency in our darkest hour, when slavers were cutting through our hull and dragging our people into cages, and what came out of the black was not death. It was not destruction. It was not the unthinking violence of a species too brutal to know the difference between rescue and rampage. What came was a ship crewed by people who had spent their entire evolutionary history learning how to survive the worst their world could throw at them, and who had taken that terrible education and turned it into something the rest of us could not build for ourselves. A shield, a promise, a presence in the dark that meant someone was always watching, always listening, always close enough to reach us before the worst could happen. They came because I asked. They stayed because people needed help. They fought because fighting was necessary. And then they held a child's hand with the same fingers that had pulled triggers and breached hulls, and carried wounded through fire. That is what a Deathworlder is. Not a warning, not a threat. A species that looked at the galaxy's suffering and decided it was their problem to fix, not because anyone asked them, but because no one else would. I know this because I was there. I pressed the button, I made the call, and they came. They always come,